The rain poured in relentless sheets, drumming against the cracked pavement and running down the alleyway in shallow rivers. Neon lights flickered against the slick surfaces of the city, their reflections twisting and bending in the puddles that had formed in the dips of the asphalt. Daniel Kessler pulled his hood tighter over his head, shaking off the water that dripped down the edge of his coat. It was late, too late, and after a grueling double shift at the clinic, he wanted nothing more than to collapse onto his bed and sleep until the next century. But just as he turned onto the narrow path leading behind his apartment complex, a sound made him stop. It wasn't a typical city noise, no drunken laughter, no distant sirens. This was different, faint, barely audible over the rain, but unmistakably pained. A mix between a whimper and a low, shuddering growl. His gut tightened. He had worked with injured animals long enough to recognize that sound. Something or someone was hurt. Daniel hesitated for only a second before moving toward the source of the noise. The alley was darker here, away from the glare of streetlights, and the shadows were thick with the scent of wet concrete and rust. He stepped carefully, his boots splashing in the shallow puddles as he scanned the area. Then he saw it. Nestled between a pile of discarded crates and the damp brick wall was a figure, small and curled in on itself. A girl, at least that's what she looked like at first glance. Slender, barely more than a shadow against the wall, her thin frame wrapped in tattered, soaked fabric. But as Daniel stepped closer, his breath hitched. Her skin wasn't human, a pale lavender hue, slick with rain and streaked with something darker, blood. Her hair, long and tangled, clung to her face in wet strands, but it wasn't just dark. It shimmered subtly, shifting between deep blue and violet when the neon light flickered across it. Her arms were wrapped around her knees, and he could see the faint glint of something sharp, claws, though they were dull and chipped. Most striking of all were her eyes, golden, large, luminous even in the dim alley, wide with something raw and primal. Fear. Daniel's pulse quickened. This wasn't the first time he had seen an alien. Ever since Earth had become an asylum for interstellar refugees, more and more non-humans had begun filtering into the cities. But he had never seen one like her. Alone, terrified, injured, he crouched, keeping his hands visible and his voice calm. "Hey!" She flinched, her entire body tightening like a coiled spring. But she didn't move away. She was too weak to run. Daniel kept his distance. "I'm not here to hurt you. You're injured." Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Only a shaky breath, her shoulders trembling from cold or pain, or both. Daniel exhaled through his nose, his mind already running through possible injuries. Blood loss? Infection? Was she malnourished? The rain made it hard to tell, but he knew she didn't have much time if she stayed out here like this. "I can help," he continued, his voice low but firm. "I work with aliens. Medical care. I just want to stop the bleeding." Her golden eyes darted to his hands, then back to his face. Her breathing was fast, uneven. "Who, man?" she rasped, the word shaky and thick with an unfamiliar accent. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, human. But that doesn't mean I'm your enemy." She didn't seem convinced. Carefully, he unzipped his jacket and shrugged it off, ignoring the bite of cold rain against his arms. He held it out to her. "You're freezing. Take this." She stared at the offering like it was a trap. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, with slow, jerky movements, she reached out. Her claws trembled as they brushed against the fabric, hesitant, uncertain. She snatched the jacket away as if expecting him to grab her, clutching it to her chest but not putting it on. "Good," Daniel murmured. "See? No tricks." She swallowed, her throat bobbing. Her breath hitched as she shifted slightly, and that was when Daniel saw it. Deep gashes running along the side of her torso, disappearing beneath the torn remnants of her clothing. Blood seeped from the wounds, mixing with rainwater, staining the pavement below. Daniel's stomach twisted. "Shit, you're hurt worse than I thought." She tensed, baring her teeth slightly, but the expression lacked real aggression. She was trying to look dangerous, but her body betrayed her. Too weak, too exhausted. Daniel's mind raced. If he left her here, she wouldn't last the night. But if he took her back to his place, he exhaled. There was no choice. I know you don't trust me, he said, shifting his stance carefully, making sure he didn't startle her. But you're bleeding out. You need shelter. Medicine. I can help you. Her ears twitched at the word help, her eyes narrowing as if weighing his sincerity. Daniel hesitated before adding, I swear, I won't hurt you. Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak. Her fingers twitched against the fabric of his jacket. Another shudder racked her thin frame, and this time, she swayed. The exhaustion was winning. Daniel cursed under his breath. If she lost consciousness here, she was as good as dead. Making a split-second decision, he reached for her. She jerked, trying to scramble away, but her strength failed her. She slumped, her body too drained to resist as Daniel carefully looped an arm around her shoulders, mindful of her injuries. Easy, he murmured. I've got you. She made a soft sound, half protest, half plea, but she didn't fight him. She couldn't. Daniel stood, lifting her with practiced ease. She was lighter than he expected, her body too thin, her breathing uneven against his chest. As he carried her out of the alley, her fingers curled weakly into his shirt. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it wasn't fear either. And for now, that was enough. The door to Daniel's apartment swung open with a quiet creak, and he stepped inside, carefully adjusting his grip on the unconscious alien girl in his arms. The warm air rushed over them, a stark contrast to the freezing rain outside, and he felt the tension in her muscles ease slightly, though she remained limp against him. Daniel kicked the door shut behind him and moved swiftly, carrying her over to the couch. He eased her down as gently as he could, mindful of her wounds, though she let out a quiet, pained sound as she shifted. The room was small but clean. His home wasn't much, just a modest apartment above the clinic where he worked. A few bookshelves lined the walls, stacked haphazardly with medical journals and old paperbacks. The faint scent of coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the antiseptic from his medkit, which was always close at hand. Daniel wasted no time. He knelt beside the couch and grabbed the emergency first aid kit from under the coffee table, snapping it open with practiced efficiency. He took a steadying breath as he peeled back the torn remnants of her soaked clothing, exposing the wounds beneath. Deep lacerations ran along her ribs, trailing down toward her hip. They weren't fresh, at least a day or two old, but the rain and grime had made things worse. The edges were swollen, tinged an unhealthy shade of purple. Damn it, he muttered under his breath. Infection. She had been running, hiding, without treatment. If he had found her even a few hours later, the fever could have killed her. Reaching into the kit, he pulled out antiseptic wipes and a bottle of saline. He poured a small amount of the liquid onto a clean cloth and pressed it against the worst of the wounds. The reaction was instant. A sharp inhale, followed by a low, pained whimper. Daniel's gaze snapped to her face. Her golden eyes were open now, half-lidded and hazy. But there, she was awake. Her breathing was shallow, her fingers twitching against the fabric of his borrowed jacket, which was still clutched in her grasp. It's okay, he said softly. I know it stings, but I have to clean it. She blinked slowly, her pupils dilating. For a second, she looked ready to bolt. Her body tensed as if she wanted to fight or flee, but the exhaustion held her down. You. Her voice was barely above a whisper, thick and foreign on her tongue. Where? You're safe, Daniel reassured her. My home. Her brows knitted together, her gaze flickering around the dimly lit room. Why? It was a simple question, but loaded with layers of fear and mistrust. Daniel paused, considering his words carefully. Because you needed help, he said finally. And I couldn't just leave you there. Her lips pressed together as if she didn't quite believe him, but she didn't argue. He continued his work, dabbing at the wounds, applying an antibiotic cream that he hoped would be safe for her species. He had treated non-humans before, but every race had its own biology, its own tolerances and weaknesses. He had no idea what she was, what her people were called, or where she had come from. But she was here now, and that was all that mattered. "Do you have a name?" he asked, voice low, trying not to startle her. She hesitated. Then, after a long silence, she whispered, "Riza." Daniel nodded. "Riza. That's a good name." She watched him, her golden eyes flicking over his face, studying him like she was trying to unravel some kind of puzzle. He could feel the weight of her gaze. Assessing, uncertain, but less afraid than before. "Human," she murmured again. "Daniel," he corrected gently. "Not just human. My name is Daniel." Riza's lips parted slightly, like she was tasting the name in her mouth. She didn't repeat it, but the tension in her shoulders eased just a fraction. He finished wrapping her wounds and sat back, rubbing a hand over his face. She needed rest. A real meal. Probably medical equipment that he didn't have here in his apartment. But she would survive for now. "You should sleep," he told her. "You'll heal faster." Her eyes flickered toward the window, where the rain still tapped lightly against the glass. The city beyond was restless, neon lights pulsing against the darkness. "I can't." Her voice was so quiet he almost didn't hear it. Daniel frowned. "Why?" She hesitated, then whispered, "He might find me." Something about the way she said it made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Daniel didn't press. Not yet. But he wasn't stupid. Someone or something had done this to her. And if she was still running, that meant whoever it was might not be far behind. His jaw tightened. "You're safe here," he said, meaning it. "I promise." Riza studied him, her golden eyes flickering with something unreadable. Then, slowly, carefully, she let her body relax against the couch. Daniel watched as sleep finally claimed her, though her fingers remained curled slightly, as if she was still expecting to wake up running. He exhaled, running a hand through his damp hair. Something told him that saving Riza had just pulled him into something much bigger than he realized. The night stretched on in heavy silence, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the city beyond the window. Daniel sat nearby, elbows resting on his knees, watching over Riza as she slept. She shifted occasionally, her brow furrowing, her fingers twitching like she was grasping at something unseen. Even in rest, she was tense, like a hunted animal waiting for the next attack. He leaned back with a quiet sigh. What the hell had he gotten himself into? Daniel wasn't naive. He had heard stories, whispers of intergalactic criminals slipping onto Earth, fleeing from conflicts that most humans would never understand. Some of them were refugees, victims of war or oppression. Others were something worse, things with pasts soaked in blood. Riza didn't strike him as the latter. She was terrified, vulnerable, and barely holding herself together. Whatever had happened to her, whatever or whoever she was running from, it wasn't over. Daniel dragged a hand down his face. He should have gone to the authorities. That would have been the smart thing to do. But the idea of turning her over to some soulless government facility, leaving her fate in the hands of people who saw aliens as little more than problems to be contained. He wasn't doing that. Riza stirred, a soft, pained sound escaping her lips. Then her eyes snapped open, wild and alert, her entire body going rigid. Daniel held up his hands, keeping his voice calm. "It's okay. You're still here. Still safe." Her breathing was fast, uneven. She blinked rapidly, taking in her surroundings as if expecting them to be different, as if she thought the safety of the apartment had only been a dream. Slowly, her body relaxed, but her gaze was sharp now, more aware. "How long?" she rasped. "Just a few hours," Daniel replied. "You needed the rest." She pushed herself up slightly, wincing as the motion pulled at her injuries. Daniel immediately reached out, but she flinched before he could touch her. "Easy," he said. "Don't tear the stitches." Riza's eyes flickered toward her wrapped wounds. She traced the bandages lightly with her claws, her expression unreadable. "You did this?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah. It's not perfect, but it'll keep you from getting worse." She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze lingering on the bandages before finally lifting to meet his. "You didn't have to," she murmured. Daniel let out a soft huff. "That's kind of how helping people works." She studied him for a long, searching moment. Then, to his surprise, her lips curved. Just slightly, just barely. A ghost of something that might have once been a smile. "You are strange," she whispered. Daniel smirked. "Takes one to know one." The moment didn't last. Riza's body tensed again, and her gaze flickered toward the window. Her fingers gripped the fabric of the couch, knuckles going pale. "He will come," she murmured, barely audible. Daniel straightened. There it was again. He exhaled slowly. "Riza, who are you running from?" She hesitated, her golden eyes shadowed. For a second, Daniel thought she wouldn't answer. Then finally she spoke. "Vorik." The name meant nothing to him, but the way she said it, low, like something dark and poisonous, sent a chill down his spine. "Who is he?" Daniel pressed. Her fingers clenched. "A hunter." Daniel frowned. "A bounty hunter?" Riza shook her head. "Worse." She didn't elaborate, but she didn't have to. He had seen enough fear in his life to recognize genuine terror when he saw it. "He won't stop," she whispered. "Not until I'm dead." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Why? What does he want?" Riza swallowed, something flickering in her gaze. Guilt, hesitation, pain. "I ran away." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was not supposed to." Daniel waited, giving her space to continue. Finally, she exhaled. "My kind, we do not get to choose our fate," she murmured. "We are given one." Her claws traced the edge of the fabric on her lap. "I was supposed to be given to him." Daniel's stomach twisted. "Given?" Riza's gaze darkened. "He calls it an honor. I call it a cage." The weight of her words settled over the room, heavy and suffocating. Daniel clenched his fists, a slow burn of anger curling in his gut. He didn't need more details to understand. He had seen too many stories like this before. Someone with power had decided she belonged to them, and when she had said no, they had hunted her for it. Daniel exhaled sharply. "You're not going back to him." Riza's eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across her face. He leaned forward. "I don't care who he is. I don't care what he thinks he's entitled to. He doesn't get to take you." She stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she whispered, "You don't understand. He is not human. You cannot fight him." Daniel tilted his head. "And," Riza blinked. "And, you are human." Daniel let out a short, humorless chuckle. "You'd be surprised how much trouble we can cause when we put our minds to it." Riza didn't speak. But for the first time, the fear in her eyes wasn't hopeless, just uncertain, like she wasn't used to someone fighting for her. Daniel leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "Look, we'll figure this out. But first, you need to eat something. You look like you haven't had a decent meal in days." Riza hesitated, but hunger was a powerful thing. Slowly, she nodded. Daniel stood and moved to the small kitchenette, rummaging through cabinets. He didn't have much, he wasn't exactly a gourmet chef, but he could manage something simple. Minutes later, he placed a warm plate of food in front of her. She hesitated before reaching out, taking slow, careful bites, as if expecting it to be taken away at any moment. Daniel sat across from her, watching. He wasn't sure what the hell he had just stepped into. But he did know one thing. Whoever Vorik was, whatever he thought he was entitled to, he wasn't getting Riza back. The tension in the apartment was palpable, thick like an unseen storm pressing in on all sides. Riza sat by the window, her golden eyes reflecting the neon glow of the city outside. She held the mug of tea Daniel had given her, cradling it between her hands, though she hadn't taken a sip. She was listening, waiting. Daniel could feel it too, that unshakable sense that something was coming, that someone was coming. He tightened his grip on the pistol hidden beneath the table. It wasn't much against an alien threat, but it was better than nothing. He had already reinforced the door and blacked out the windows, but he knew deep down that locks wouldn't stop whoever Vorik was. Riza let out a slow breath. "You don't have to do this," Daniel scoffed. "Yeah, pretty sure I do." Her gaze flickered toward him. "You barely know me. I am not your fight." Daniel leaned back against the chair, shaking his head. "Doesn't work like that." You came to me for help. That's all I need to know. She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to understand why he would risk himself for someone like her. He wasn't sure he could put it into words, but deep down he knew the answer. Because she deserved to choose her own life. And if he had to stand between her and the monster chasing her, then so be it. The air shifted. A strange, unnatural pressure crawled over Daniel's skin, making the hairs on the back of his neck rise. A second later, Riza moved, dropping the mug and spinning toward the door, her claws bared. The lights flickered. A shadow loomed beyond the reinforced steel of the apartment door. Then, boom! The entire door blasted inward, hinges shrieking as it crashed against the floor. The force of it sent Daniel stumbling back, shielding his face from the debris. And then he saw him, Vorik, tall, broad, wrapped in dark armor that gleamed like obsidian. His face was concealed behind a mask, but Daniel could feel the gaze underneath it, cold, predatory. The air around him crackled with restrained power, and when he stepped forward, the floorboards groaned under his weight. Riza, Vorik rumbled, his voice like distant thunder. She didn't flinch. She stood her ground. Not another step, Daniel warned, raising the pistol. Vorik's head tilted slightly, as if acknowledging him for the first time. A slow, dismissive chuckle rumbled from behind his mask. You are either brave, he said, or foolish. Daniel didn't lower the gun. I get that a lot. Vorik took another step. This is not your concern, human. Stand aside. Daniel glanced at Riza. She was rigid, her claws trembling, but she didn't back away. He could see it, the terror in her eyes. But beneath it, something else was growing. A spark. She had spent so long running. Now she was standing. Daniel turned back to Vorik, his grip steady. Yeah, see. That's not gonna happen. There was a moment of silence, stretched impossibly thin. Then Vorik moved. He was fast, inhumanly fast, crossing the room in the blink of an eye. Daniel barely had time to fire before the alien swatted the gun from his hands like it was nothing. The impact sent a sharp pain lancing through his wrist, but he ignored it, already moving. Vorik lunged. Daniel ducked under the strike, pivoting toward the kitchen. He grabbed the first thing within reach, a cast iron skillet, and swung. The skillet cracked against Vorik's head with a dull clang. Vorik staggered. Not much, but enough. Riza moved. She shot forward, her claws igniting with a strange, burning energy. With a sharp snarl, she slashed across Vorik's chest, sending sparks flying from his armor. He roared, spinning with a violent backhand, but she dodged, moving with the precision of someone who had been born to fight. Daniel scrambled for his gun, but he didn't need it. Riza wasn't running anymore. She was fighting. Vorik swung again, but this time she was ready. She ducked low, her claws flashing as she raked them upward, tearing into the weak points of his armor. A crackle of energy pulsed from her attack, sending him stumbling back this time. For the first time, he hesitated. You dare? Vorik rasped, his voice laced with disbelief. Riza stood tall, chest heaving, her golden eyes burning with something fierce, something free. I was never yours, she growled. And then, she struck again. Her claws plunged deep into Vorik's chest. A burst of energy erupted from the impact, sending him crashing through the already broken door. He skidded across the hallway floor, motionless. Silence. Heavy, tense silence. Daniel exhaled sharply, gripping the counter for balance. His pulse thundered in his ears. Riza stood over Vorik's fallen form, her claws still crackling with power. She stared down at him for a long moment, then slowly, carefully, stepped back. It was over. Vorik wasn't dead, his chest still rose and fell, but he wasn't getting up anytime soon. Daniel let out a breathless laugh, running a hand through his hair. You okay? Riza turned to him. She looked exhausted, her limbs shaking slightly, but she was alive. She nodded. A slow, relieved smile pulled at the corners of her lips. Daniel grinned. Not bad for a first stand-your-ground moment. She let out a quiet, breathy laugh, small, but real. For the first time since they met, she didn't look afraid. Daniel pushed off the counter, walking over to her. "So, what now?" Riza hesitated, glancing down at Vorik one last time. Then, slowly, she looked up at him. "You said I could choose my own path," she murmured. He nodded. "Yeah, still true." She exhaled softly. Then, to his surprise, she reached out, her fingers slipping into his. Warm, solid, real. Then, she whispered, "I choose to stay." Daniel blinked. Then, with a small smirk, he gave her hand a light squeeze. "Good choice." And for the first time in a long, long time, Riza felt free.